Hi, I'm Sam Junta, and this is Crash Course Advanced Placement United States History, and today we are going to discuss the development of distinctly African American music and its social influence from the slave field hollers to the politically focused music of the Civil Rights Movement. Our 100% Irish producer, Bridget Grew, drew this, an African drum, because obviously that is the most significant symbol of anything from African culture ever. Our goal today is to answer three very big questions. First of which is, what was the impact on the institution of slavery as a result of slaves developing music as a response to their bondage and suppression of identity? Two, how does changing musical expression during the 1920s and 30s and the Harlem Renaissance develop a distinctly free black culture as opposed to slave-based society? And finally, three, how did African American music in the 1960s support the Civil Rights Movement?
Mr. Junta, will we learn about Snoop Dogg and how he influenced music?
Oh, me of the past, my Dewey days are far behind me. Take it away, Thought Bubble. The goal of answering these questions is to have an understanding of the validity of this statement. African Americans have historically developed and evolved various forms of music throughout their existence in the United States as a response to the cultural conditions. These musical forms have at times led to a greater sense of social justice and reform. Slavery existed in the United States as early as 1502 and would continue through to 1865. Slavery soon began to control the southern United States economy, and in the decades leading up to the Civil War, slaves accounted for a third of the population of the southern United States, and the cotton they produced accounted for nearly half of the value of American exports. The peculiar institution consumed southern life for both blacks and whites. African Americans did develop uniquely black styles of music as soon as they were brought to the Americas, placing a large emphasis on instrumentation, either bringing instruments with them or recreating instruments when they arrived in the Americas. The style of singing among Africans was notably unique, and the throat noises, unlike anything Anglo-Saxon colonizers utilized, were present throughout this burgeoning music group. Other distinct features of slave music that developed would later influence future styles of black music, including intricate rhythm patterns, off-key notes, sounds without a distinct meaning, and foot padding. The formation of clearly black music as a response to slavery was used for a variety of reasons, such as religious ceremonies, coordination of work, and the commentary on slave masters. But, unfortunately, slave music was taken by white masters when they forced slaves to sing whenever they commanded it. Music would remain present throughout black history in America, including into the 20th century. From slavery, we move into the early 20th century. The Harlem Renaissance, also known as the New Negro Movement, took shape in the early 1920s and lasted until the 1930s. The African Americans who participated in this movement were the first generation of African Americans in the U.S. who were not directly born from slaves. The influence of these new artists and musicians turned Harlem into a center of changing African American culture. Harlem served direct connections to the migration of many African Americans from the South to the North, where they could experience the shaping of their culture. Harlem was not the only place where this influence was emerging, but it was most certainly the biggest and gained the most attention. The Harlem Renaissance helped to cultivate some of the most influential music of the time and helped to really define the genres of both blues and jazz. Blues music is a traditionally southern type of music that was first fabricated in the Mississippi Delta region. They used blues to fight adversity as it told of these struggles and band communities together and created a strong sense of black culture and resilience to black oppression. Blues songs described love, sadness, and hardship in life. The other forms of music was jazz. First coined in the 1800s, but not coined by the term jazz until the early 1900s, it was a combination of a plethora of different genres and cultures originating from New Orleans. In the 1920s, jazz moved its way from the South to the boroughs and cities of the North. Jazz was a response to the modernizing of the world and emphasized individual voices and opinions influencing literature, film, and the visual arts fields. The jazz era helped to cultivate success among black artists who, despite racial discrimination and segregation, like Louis Armstrong, were seen for more of their music and less for their race. The song, West End Blues, was most famously recorded by Louis Armstrong in 1928, and his playing established a new standard for rhythmic and melodic complexity within jazz music. From this, a smaller subgenre of jazz known as swing emerged with emphasis on its offbeat rhythms and popularity as dance music. This new subgenre of jazz changed the jazz landscape, and with the introduction of artists and composers like Benny Goodman, who were white, the influence could be seen to start spreading to white culture and affecting it, as many overlooked the racial differences of artists because of their music. Music during the Harlem Renaissance influenced all artists within it, as well as helped to spread the influence that African Americans had over music, art, and literature across the spectrum of the American landscape, forever changing the way that black culture was viewed and creating a distinct difference in their culture and others.
Hi, I'm Mr. Genta. I'm kidding. Just a little silliness for you. I'm Miss Grew. Today I'm going to be talking about an open letter. But what to, you might ask? Instruments. Instrumentation has become increasingly important in African American music, particularly beginning during the Harlem Renaissance, when individuals were making a name for themselves and a whole brand just based off one instrument. Think of Louis Armstrong. No one is more closely associated with the trumpet. This is a distinct departure from African American music during slave times, when most music was based simply on vocal ability and call and response patterns. This makes sense and also demonstrates the increasing power of African Americans, specifically economically, developing from a time when they could barely afford to create a drum or get paid to play a fiddle. And yet, now during the Harlem Renaissance, they were able to buy instruments and make a name for themselves. This is a further evolution occurs during the Civil Rights Movement, when the use of the guitar became exceptionally prevalent, particularly with African Americans. It's very notable to see instrumentation evolution, no matter how much instruments are kind of the worst. Take the clarinet, for example. Have you ever tried to play it? It's truly horrible. It doesn't sound good. It's bad. Even if you're a good clarinet player, you're not a good musician. I'm just saying. Talk to Mr. Owens about that one. You know what? That's the end of our open letter. Sincerely, a girl who wishes she knew how to play any instrument, ever.
Moving on from the early 20th century, we move into the larger portion of the 20th century where the civil rights movement spanned a lot of that time. After World War I, many African American families began to move from the South into northern urban centers. As they moved, racial tensions grew and developed all over the nation. Signs segregating specific locations and objects for whites only or coloreds only became increasingly popular. With the start of World War II, even more African Americans moved from the rural South to factories in the North. As more and more African Americans moved, tensions between whites and blacks continued to grow. African Americans began to form unions and civil rights advocacy groups. Throughout the 1940s, the civil rights movement grew and developed. In order to spread their message, music was used. Songs like We Shall Overcome and What's Going On promoted civil rights and resistance to oppression. We Shall Overcome existed and was used for a century prior to the civil rights movement. It was composed in the late 1910s by Reverend C.A. Tindley, and its first major use was by striking tobacco workers in 1945 to voice their opinions. It was adapted for the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and during the summer of 1963, 250,000 people sang the hymn led by Joan Baez as they marched on Washington. After that march, the hymn became the anthem of the civil rights movement. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson used the song title as his last line in his speech he made to Congress promoting the civil rights movement. It is said that the reference to the song combined with the speech's passion for the civil rights made Martin Luther King cry. What's Going On was composed by Marvin Gaye and then recorded in 1971. The song dealt with issues of racism, opposition to the Vietnam War, civil rights, environmental awareness, and corrupt politics. Black artists of this era adopted a nationalistic ideology and more began to identify with their African heritage in dress and style. With an increase in poverty, unemployment, and a lack of education in the 1970s and 80s, rap began to grow in popularity to support the African American civil rights movement. Rap combines traditional methods of oral history with modern music, production, and style. Black music is an entirely distinct form of art and expression. The fact that we even say black music demonstrates its significance within popular American culture. Currently, black music has a connotation built by racial stereotypes, that is, it's ghetto, lacks grammatical panache, and is unsophisticated. In reality, black music has a rich history within the United States. It developed from people who were owned and evolved through the courage of people who were told where they could and could not go to the bathroom, and was pushed forward by people who were fighting for their rights to exist as equal members of our society. Black music came about because of ownership, oppression, and overt discrimination. In a country where black people are instantly doubted, stereotyped, and discriminated against, their abilities to rise up and curate a culture distinct to themselves shows their power as a people. When America began to enslave black people, there was no telling where black culture would evolve, and most likely, people would have predicted that black culture would never exist. This is exemplified by music that strikes the soul and flutters the heart. Black music is not ghetto and unsophisticated. In fact, it is quite the opposite. It is powerful, rich, and meaningful. Black music has and will continue to exist in order to defy white power and continues to push society into a more open and free
Crash Course is produced and directed by Brandon McQueen. Our script supervisor is Brandon McQueen. Our gaff boy is Bridget Grew. And the show is written by my high school history teacher, Mr. Emerton. Brandon McQueen. Every week there's a new caption to Libertage, but today's episode was so sad that we couldn't fit a Libertage in. Until now. Suggest libertarian captions in the comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we always say in my hometown, don't forget to be abolitionists.